this week, I'm going to be, of course, continuing talking about, absolutism, which I guess the main thing we'll talk about is the reign of Louis XIV. Then I am going to get into the Habsburgs also as well and talk about them. Good morning, Hope. How are you doing out there? Hope you're having a great morning and all of that. I'm going to talk about the Habsburg Empire, as well, which I'll kind of talk about the Spanish one first they had, and then they had the Austrian one that'll kind of break away from that. So that's kind of where we're at right now. I think we had already started some stuff talking about Louis XIV. I think we had already discussed how Louis XIV became the third Bourbon king that came in. He was considered the greatest absolutist, of course, probably in that period of age of absolutism overall. I think I told you he reigned one of the longest in European history, reigned like 72 years, 72-year reign from 1643 to 1750. And I told you he had all kinds of nicknames. The Sun King, I think, was the common name. They called him Louis the Great, the Grand Monarch or Great Monarch. So he was called all kinds of nicknames throughout Europe, and everybody wanted to copy him, not just, build palaces like him, but his craft of state, how he ran the state, kind of micromanaged it, I guess. Everybody wanted to copy him more or less. Now, I think I told you already about his motto, right? His motto was, "I am the state." I think I mentioned about that before also as well. So I'm going to get to it later and talk about, his famous palace that he built. I'll probably get to that in a second, not yet, but I did want to talk about his early life, what he did like early on, because he wasn't like all absolute when he, first came in and became king of France. I think I told you he became king when he was 4 years old, really young, 1643. And most of his, if you study about his early reign, it was controlled by this cardinal under him, who was kind of like his chief minister named Jules Mazarin, who was, by the way, handpicked by Cardinal Richelieu, who had been pretty much the chief minister before that overall. And Mazarin worked hand in hand with Louis XIV's mother, who had been married to, Louis XIII's father, who was Queen Anne, or Anne of Austria, they called her. And so those two kind of were the ones that kind of controlled the state, basically, when Louis was a minority, which is what they use the term for that, when a king is too young to rule by himself. I believe I have some other slides like this you can see right here. So you can see Mazarin was a cardinal in the Catholic Church. He was kind of controversial, Mazarin. A lot of the nobility did not like Mazarin. They called him nasty nicknames like the Italian thief, because he thought he and the Catholic Church were trying to take over the country and all that. And eventually in 1649, there was a conflict that broke out in France that was called they call it the Fronde, is what it was called, which lasted about 3 years. It was like a civil war that took place where a lot of the nobility rebelled against Louis XIV and Jules Mazarin. Anyway, what ended up happening was eventually the king's side, of course, eventually won the conflict. This all happened, I think, because Spain and France had kind of been at war before that because of the 30 Years' War and all that. So there's a lot of tensions going on in Europe. And anyway, it was kind of like the last gasp of the nobility trying to retain their power in the country. And they think that after Mazarin and Louis XIV won that conflict, pretty much the king became absolute, like the actual state and the government and all that. So it kind of accelerated, you could say, absolutism, when Louis XIV would step in as the sole ruler over time. Because before that, like I think I've mentioned this before, how a lot of the nobility had their own personal armies and their own castles and things like that. And after that, they didn't really have much power afterwards. There's another story I usually mention about, which I'll go back to this here. There was supposedly this secret thing between Queen Anne of Austria and Jules Mazarin. They think they were secret lovers. Like she was like a mistress of him. They think they may have even married because there was like they called him like what was a nickname they dubbed him? They called him the custodian of the Queen's bed. I think was one of the nicknames that they called Jules Mazarin. So whether they married, I don't know, but I think there's a lot of stories that they were secret lovers or something like that. I think even when Louis XIII was I think king, they may have been lovers. Kind of strange about that. So that's the side story, but Louis did eventually marry, by the way. His main wife he would eventually marry in 1660 was known as Maria Theresa of Spain, who was really a Habsburg, I believe is what she was. And she was a princess in Spain, but so she would marry her, who, by the way, was like his cousin, basically. Oh, maybe a first cousin. And anyway, it was mostly a political marriage between the two states to try to bring Spain and France together because they had been at war, going back to the 30 Years' War. So that was his main wife. But if you know about Louis XIV, later on in his life, he had a lot of mistresses, I think up to 5 main mistresses. And his most famous mistress was Marquis de Maintenon, who was like basically his main advisor later. Yeah. So a lot of these women would be like mistresses and advisors to a lot of the kings. You may have heard of Madame Pompadour. You may have heard of her, who was a famous mistress and advisor to Louis XV, which came after. So that's something you see a lot. You always see these like head mistresses that are usually with the king, and they're probably lovers too on top of that, but they also do a lot of advising and things like that. Interesting about that. Now, of course, the thing that Louis XIV is real famous for, if you know about it, was in the 1660s, he began building his famous chateau, which, of course, is the Palace of Versailles, which would take place over something like 20 years that it was actually constructed. At least the main construction of Versailles took place from 1660s, from the 1680s. Although they kept building onto it, if you know about that, up to like, I want to say 68. They kept adding on to it or making changes to it, and so on. And Versailles was built about 11 miles to the southwest of the central part of Paris. And originally it was like a suburb, I guess, now of Paris now. And the amount of workers that went into, like 40,000 workers were used to build Versailles. And after its completion, it became like the central court of not just Louis XIV, but also 2 other kings later, Louis XV and also Louis XVI. So you can see it was the central court of France for over 100 years, up to like the French Revolution breaking out in 1789. The kind of architecture, of course, that went into Versailles was called Baroque style architecture, which was influenced by the Italian Renaissance. So a lot of like neoclassical type architecture you see later that they use in France and other countries was heavily influenced by the Italians overall. And there were different architects that were involved in the building of Versailles. I think I've got them right here listed. So you can see it was started in 1661. Those are all the famous people that were involved in the construction of Versailles. You got Louis Laveau, I think they talked about in the video. He was one of the first that was involved. Laveau is one of the ones that built most of the actual outside, like the facade outside that you're looking at with Versailles. He's one that actually did it. And then the Andre Le Notre, the second one there, was a landscape architect. He was the one who built all the gardens and parks. He's the one that put all the fountains in and so on, orchards and things like that, which were all designed as well. Also, two other artists. They had also Charles Le Brun, who you may have heard of. He did a lot of the artwork inside, like painting all the ceilings and the tapestries and things like that. And Louis XIV believed that Le Brun was one of the greatest French artists at the time, who lived in the 17th century. And a lot of the rooms at Versailles have different themes. There's even some where they have like Greco-Roman themes based on various mythology and things like that as well. Oh, and then on the bottom, Jules Mansart, or Mansart, of course, was the one who designed that famous Hall of Mirrors, which really the Hall of Mirrors is the most famous, room inside, the actual Palace of Versailles. I do have other pictures too they have of Versailles. Of course, there's a famous courtyard. You can see that the palace had two wings, one on the left and one on the right. And of course, the apartments for the king were on the right, and the ones for the queen were on the left that were there. Of course, this part was built later by the 1670s. Mansart, of course, is the one who built, like I said, the Hall of Mirrors, which became the central gallery of Versailles, where, the king would meet a lot of different dignitaries from different countries. And you can see the design, 246 feet long by 33 feet wide. Originally, the palace had about 226 rooms in it, but over time, other kings expanded it. I think it's now got 700 that are now part of it. And the Hall of Mirrors is famous for its, clad mirrors, which there's like 17 of them, which I think each mirror, how many does it have on each mirror? I forget exactly. Yeah, each mirror has like 350 pieces of glass on them. And the Hall of Mirrors was used for all kinds of things, not just for meeting dignitaries, but they would have balls there as well. Weddings. There was even cases where there were stories where women would actually come there to give birth, or the queen would give birth there, or something like that. Kind of strange about that. And you can see the opulence of a lot of these palaces, like Versailles. So a lot of marble, gold lace went into it. Lots of fancy tapestry and paintings, of course, on the walls. A lot of the furniture was made of like gold and things like that. There's cases where I think when wars broke out, they would actually melt down some of the furniture that was made of gold, you can see there. So it's a big tourist attraction. Like billions tour pretty much Versailles every year. And basically it showed the opulence of these kings. Like, you look at France itself, the king was like very wealthy, but the average peasant, in France was pretty poor. That's the only thing about that, more or less. Originally, there was a gate going across here, but it was torn down in the French Revolution when they broke into the palace after the revolution broke out. Here's some statistics on Versailles. You can see the actual grounds itself is about 2,000 acres. I think the actual palace is about 200-something acres or something like that in size. 12 miles of roads. A lot of trees. They have like orchards and different trees throughout, of course, Versailles, because there's a lot of parks and gardens that are part of these palaces. 210 flowers are planted every year. The favorite flower or plant that Louis XIV liked to plant, of course, if you know about it, was tulips. Which tulips was like real popular around the 17th century. So you can see they've got a grand canal running to it with a lot of fountains, 50 fountains and 620 fountain nozzles, of course, with it. 2,153 windows in the place, 700 rooms, like I said, 67 staircases, 6,000 paintings, 1,500 drawings, and 15,000 engravings, 2,100 sculptures, and 5,000 items of furniture and other objects of art. So it's amazing the amount of work that went into the palace. So you can see the tulips right there like we're talking about. So all this was very fancy, you're looking at. And so you have all these other, kings later, like in Germany and other places, Russia, that try to, copy, Louis the 14th. I think Peter the Great did the same thing in Russia with his Peterhof, and you have the Schönbrunn Palace, another one too, like that the Austrians developed in Vienna. So all these different states, copied them. Oh, one more thing about the Hall of Mirrors you may have heard about, which I guess I want to mention about too. It is famous for various peace treaties being signed there. Of course, the most famous one was signed in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I and pretty much caused World War II. I think they also say that's where the German Empire was founded too, in 1871. The Hall of Mirrors, right after the Franco-Prussian War, of course, ended. Right, yeah. Let me also talk about some other things about under Louis XIV. Now, Louis didn't really have a chief minister officially, not officially, though usually he's kind of seen as it. They usually call him as a chief minister or first minister of state, but it never was official. I don't think it was an official title. In fact, his real title was, I think it was Controller General of Finances. And that, of course, was Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert was very instrumental in developing the French economy and making France a powerful state. And his brand of mercantilism had a nickname. It was called Colbertism, I think was usually what people called it. And Colbertism was a form of mercantilism where one of the things he was trying to do was he was trying to create as much wealth as possible via their colonies throughout the French Empire, which was based all over the world. Mercantilism is like a new form of economics prior to like capitalism that pretty much is used by all the powers in the world. Spain, Portugal, Britain, the Dutch, etc., all have mercantilism. And the whole point of mercantilism is to use colonies to create natural resources that make products and then make as much gold as possible and trying to sell them all over the place. Colbert was instrumental in developing their colonies throughout the world. Of course, the main ones they had was in Canada, the New France, French Canada. He began to expand that more, of course. And in Canada, the French had a monopoly on the fur trade. That was the big thing there. They also fished off the east coast of Canada as well for like cod and other fish as well. In India, the French were in India. They, of course, had like coffee, pepper, spices, and cotton, things like that that came from there. On the West Indies, like in the Caribbean, they also were like on where Haiti is, which is actually, I think the French called Haiti Saint-Domingue, of course, where they had a lot of sugar plantations, and they made sugar and rum, out of that. So they create all these products and, of course, sell them throughout the empire and try to make as much gold as possible. Colbert was also instrumental. He did a lot of things. Colbert created a glass industry in France, which was, that before that, the Italians controlled all the glass, which is true in Europe. And so he created his own glass company it's called Saint Gobain, I think is what they call it now. That's the name they call it now. It's still around since he formed it. So he did that. He founded the French Navy, founded the French Merchant Marine also as well. They think Colbert is the one under Louis XIV that sent all the explorers like, Joliet Marquette, La Salle, and so on to explore the New World, the Mississippi River, and all that, which that leads to like Louisiana being founded as a colony later, which was part of New France, actually, the southern part of it anyway. He also, he expanded their transportation. So he built like roads and canals throughout France. He raised tariffs. He actually wanted to get rid of tariffs, apparently, but he never did for some reason. But he did raise tariffs. Now, I think they say he's somehow connected with the Code Noir or Black Code, which controlled and restricted slavery throughout the French Empire, especially like in the New World, like in Louisiana and like in the Caribbean, predominantly is where they had mostly African slavery as a whole. So yeah, he kind of helped establish that, although that was really from an edict through Louis XIV. So yeah, Colbert was pretty important in controlling the state, but he died in 1683. And after his death, they think the French economy started kind of going down more after that. And then the thing that happened after that, which is kind of controversial under Louis XIV, he revoked the Edict of Nantes. It's something that was kind of well known. You may have heard about the story about this, which happened in October of 1685. He issued this new edict called the Edict of Fontainebleau, just named after one of his palaces he lived at in Paris sometimes. And what it did was it revoked all of the religious rights of the Huguenots, which, you remember, the Huguenots were the French Protestants that followed Calvinism. They were all basically, their religion was banned in the country. They couldn't practice it anymore. And so it was like this: they could either forced to convert or leave the country. Was pretty much what he told them to do. And so basically, about the thousands, they all left France. There's kind of a debate about how many left. I know it says 100,000, but I think the numbers are anywhere from 100,000, almost 1 million people may have actually left the country because of that. And he closed down all their churches. He closed down all their schools. And so many of them fled to different countries in Europe, like in Germany, the Dutch. I think there was even some that went to like England or even America. I think some even went to the British colonies in North America as well. So why did he do this and all that? Well, they believe that he revoked it because Louis was a staunch Catholic. He didn't really like Protestantism. He believed that the country ought to be like, he said that they ought to have one France, one king, one religion, was his belief. So he didn't want the Catholics to have he didn't want the Protestants to have any religious, practice. And then he didn't want them to have any power either, like political power, share any power, with him. But they do think it caused a brain drain. Like what I mean by that is that you had all these different Protestants that, had various skills in the economy, like artisans, merchants, and other people. And when they left, it kind of caused their economy to start going down. And then on top of that, all the wars that Louis got into, pretty much then and after that, he was in numerous wars in the late 17th century to try to expand his empire in Europe, especially in Germany. That got him into a lot of wars with the Holy Roman Empire in Austria, which we'll talk about later, under Emperor Leopold I. He was one of the main rulers in the late 17th century, and he was the big rival of Louis XIV. I think they were somehow related. I think they were cousins somehow. I think they were cousins, I believe. And so those two didn't like each other too much, and so they fought numerous wars, more or less. But like I said, Louis XIV would reign a really long time. You can see here's, by the way, kind of the map of showing all these different wars that they would get involved in. But Louis, back up to, I guess go to here next. But Louis would remain king until about 1715, I believe, when he died. And he had a great grandson that would come in, of course, which would be Louis XV. It was known as the Beloved, that they called him, sort of. And he was the fourth Bourbon king. And Louis, by the way, had outlived all of his sons. He outlived all of his grandsons. And so he had lived so long, that I think he was like 76 when he died, that he basically was forced to give the throne to his great grandson. And he supposedly left him a letter, by the way, behind when he died, telling him not to do all the things that he had done, spending all opulent on all this money on stuff, all these wars that he got into. And of course, Louis XV didn't listen to him, and stuff like that. So he kept spending money, and they also kept spending money on like wars and stuff like that. Several wars after that. Like the 7 Years' War, I guess, was the worst one that they have later. But anyway, so I'm going to move on. Of course, I'm going to talk about, we'll get more back to the Bourbons later, especially when we get more closer to like the French Revolution. I'll get more into them again. But let me go ahead and move on to talk about Central Europe, what's kind of going on over there at the same time with the Age of Absolute. You've got also these two different states that emerge in Central Europe, which is kind of not rarely used much. Central Europe, they use Western Europe and Eastern Europe more. But Central Europe is an area that's kind of between what is basically France and what is like Poland. That would be kind of the area that we're kind of talking. Although they think Poland's kind of in Central Europe also as well. I've got multiple maps to kind of show you about where it is. Central Europe would kind of be like right here. So from probably like Poland, around Poland or Western Poland to like close to where the Rhine River is. And so a bunch of countries are in there. The two common states that are mostly there are Austria and Prussia. Austria in the south, Prussia in the north, which kind of emerge out of the Holy Roman Empire. They kind of break away from it or were part of it at one point, both those states that would emerge later. And the big state, which I'll talk about, that comes first. So you got these two first that I just talked about. Oh, and by the way, they have different dynasties, which I guess I'll briefly talk about the Hohenzollerns first, more or less. They have the Hohenzollern dynasty, which is in Prussia, which started, I think, around the maybe 15th century or something like that in the late Middle Ages. And that's the state that will develop the Kingdom of Prussia, which will over time become Germany, the German state we know today overall. And Austria, which is to the south, like above Italy, was called different names. It was called the Habsburg Empire, Habsburg Monarchy. Later on, they called it Austria-Hungary or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was never had an official name to it, but Habsburg dynasty is an old dynasty that goes back to like the High Middle Ages, long time ago. Although really, I guess it starts probably around the same time, around the 15th century, as actual rulers, I guess. But I want to talk about the Habsburg Empire first. So we'll get into them a little bit today and talk about that state that's there. And it does break up. Over time, you'll see that the Habsburg Empire is made up of different states that are part of it. It's not really one state, but multiple states. And so that is the main one. The one we know about, of course, Habsburg Empire was split into two different states. You got the Spanish Empire, which is mostly Spain, part of Italy, the Netherlands, and then part of the New World. And the Austrian Empire was the one that was basically in Central Europe, Northern Italy too. Later, the Netherlands also as well, but most of like Germany would be the Holy Roman Empire. That'll be there. And Habsburgs for a long time, like 400 years, will control the title of Holy Roman Emperor. That's something that they're kind of known for. If you know about that state. And I'll first talk about the fact that they have two different branches of the Habsburgs. That's famous. You have what they call Habsburg Spain. Habsburg Spain usually dates from about 1516, and it goes up to 1700. They're descended back to the Habsburgs, but also related back to Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the early kings of what would be Spain later over time. They only had mostly 6 kings that would actually reign over it, with the most famous being Emperor Charles V, which I think I've got some pictures of him if you want to look at him. Charles V was considered to be one of the first, what we call King of Spain. Here he is right here, official King of Spain that controlled over the combined states of what would be Spain or the Spanish Empire, more or less. He reigned in the 16th century. If you know about Charles, Charles was the greatest ruler in Europe at the time when he reigned. He was greatest ruler, and pick something right here. But yeah, he lived in the 16th century, and his territories were vast. He controlled a region of territory which was like something like 1.5 million square miles, which, by the way, nobody had controlled that amount of territory, I want to say, in Europe since the reign of Charlemagne. Charlemagne lived around like 800. So you're looking at like 700 something years later that he reigns over this vast amount of territory that he does. All those areas in green he controlled at one point. Spain, parts of Italy. You can see northern Italy too as well. He controlled the Netherlands, all pretty much area of Austria, Bohemia, Transylvania, part of Hungary. Hungary was all controlled. And don't forget that Charles also controlled parts of the New World, like Peru, Mexico, the Caribbean, were all controlled under him. It's, by the way, under him where they get that famous quote you may have heard of, the sun never sets. I heard that term before. The sun never sets on the, Spanish Empire, which the British kind of use also as well. The sun never sets should be actually. You also control the Philippines. Forgot about that. Philippines also as well. So he's got, colonies all over the world, pretty much, that he's got. New World, Pacific, Ocean, also as well. Remember correctly, Charles was the one that was also involved. And by the way, you'll notice he's called Charles the First. You probably see that. Charles V was his title as Holy Roman Emperor, like over Germany. And then Charles I was his title over Spain, the King of Spain, which the Spanish called him not Charles, Carlos, of course, is what they call him over there, which is Spanish for Charles. But yeah, he was also involved in the Reformation, if you remember correctly. He's the one that tried to stop the spread of Luther's ideas after he, published the 95 Theses and all that. And so Charles was the one that issued the Edict of Worms to try and stop him, which of course failed, as you know. It then led to the rise of Lutheranism that followed. And then also Charles V was the one involved with the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, where he made that alliance with the different German princes that were Protestant, which to try to alleviate any kind of civil war that might break out in the Holy Roman Empire. So he was involved in a lot of different things, Charles V, overall. Later, he split the empire up. I don't know if you know about this, but later in the mid-16th century, he gave like half of his lands, which were in Germany, to his younger brother, Ferdinand I. And so that's what created the so-called Austrian Habsburg Empire, or Habsburg monarchy, that they also call it as well. And so all those lands you're looking at, which are mostly, if you go up this map here, pretty much he gave him the Netherlands, pretty much all the territories in the north here, like Milan area, Austria and Hungary, Bohemia. So all these areas here went to his brother. And so that broke away. And the Austrian Habsburg state over there, or states, became like a junior branch, basically. Then he had this, I think I've got a picture of, so you can see the two branches right here. You've got the junior branch over here, the Habsburg monarchy, and then the Spanish Habsburg Empire over here. They actually controlled Portugal for a while, Habsburgs. So you can see they controlled, like the Spanish ones controlled like southern Italy. So you can see the influence there later that they have. However, he had a Charles also I don't know if you know about him. He retired, eventually stepped down, abdicated the throne eventually. And he had a son who came in next, who, of course, was known as Philip II, who A lot of historians also call him Philip the Prudent. And he reigned as the King of Spain from 1556 to 1598. And he reigned during a very famous period you may have heard of called the Spanish Golden Age. It was the peak of Spanish like art and culture, and also the peak of the Spanish Empire, which peaked really in the 17th century overall later. And anyway, Philip, we won't talk as much about him more or less today, but Philip was the one that tried to invade England. If you know about this in 1588 with the attack of the Spanish Armada. So his so-called Invincible Armada that tried to attack England in the summer of 1588, July, August, I think it was. And the English Navy defeated him. And of course, it helped solidify England as a major power at the time of Queen Elizabeth I and King James that would come in afterwards as a whole. Of course, the Philippines is named after his son, Philip II, as well. And the Spanish, like the Habsburgs, they would only reign till 1700. I don't know if you know what happened with this, but they had, like I told you, I think only about 6 kings, I think there were, that ruled over they only had 6 kings that reigned. And one of the last was King Charles II, who had no heirs because he didn't have any children. And so the throne went to the Bourbons. The French Bourbons took it over. And I'll get to it later, but one of the grandsons of Louis the 14th will actually take over Spain, which was a big controversy, by the way, in Europe when that happened. Kiara, by the way, is joining us. Good morning. Hope you're doing great out there overall. So I'll come back later and talk about England and Spain when they get into conflict under Queen Elizabeth I. That's not something we're really going to do today much. But I did want to go ahead and talk about and move on to talk about the Austrian side of it, like what happens with the Habsburg Empire of the Austrian side of that, which I just talked about this earlier, but the Habsburg Empire, or it's actually called that, or Habsburg Monarchy, it's the common name they called it, was really around from 1440 to 1780. It's when actually had real rulers reigning in Germany. And you can see all the different names it was called. Austrian Empire is a common name. They start using like in the 18th century. Austro-Hungarian Empire as well. It's another name they start using too. And then also Austria-Hungary. I don't have it on there, but Austria-Hungary was another name that they also used as well, along with Habsburg Monarchy. Habsburg Monarchy, I think, is the common name that they often use it. While the different names, they never had an official name. They call of this Austrian Empire they had. It wasn't just Austria. It was basically a collection of states. You had Austria in it, Hungary, Bohemia, Transylvania, Northern Italy. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire also as well, parts of it. Not all of it, but parts of it were part of the Holy Roman Empire. And I told you also that the Habsburgs were the ones that controlled the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. So they're all Holy Roman Emperor, I think, for like 300-400 years that they pretty much controlled it, more or less. Now, I'd usually get into talking about some of the rulers. I do have a map showing you like all the areas that they mostly control. That's the peak of the empire of the 17th, 18th century you're looking at, which will be expanded over time. Some of their expansion was through like marriage, like intermarriage with different families, and then also through wars, that they were able to create a larger state over time. One thing about the Austrian Habsburg Empire and all that, it was a multi-ethnic state. So there were different peoples that were part of it, that were in it. You had Austrians, you had Hungarians, you had Czechs, and so you had some Poles that were in it. Italians in the north, like around Tyrol as well. Jews and other groups that are part of that region. Now, Emperor Leopold I, he'll be basically one of their first, great rulers that you really hear about under the Habsburg Empire. And he was a famous ruler of the Habsburgs that lived in the 17th century, in the 1600s. And he was one of the longest reigning of the Habsburgs that they have, at least the main Habsburgs, up to I think it's up to the 1700s. And you can see he reigned about 46 years, 1658 to about 1705. He was Holy Roman Emperor, and he had a bunch of other titles: Archduke of Austria, King of Hungary, King of Transylvania, King of Bohemia, etc. And Leopold is famous for expanding the Habsburg monarchy or Habsburg Empire. That's one thing he does during his reign. And he did this through a lot of wars, mostly through conflicts with the Ottoman Empire or Ottoman Turks who were in Central Eastern Europe. And he also fought in Western Germany against Louis XIV, who was his rival and cousin, who was trying to expand into parts of Germany. And I guess the most famous conflict I usually talk about that's well known that took place under Leopold was the Great Turkish War, which has all kinds of names. I think the common name is also called the Habsburg-Ottoman War. That happened in the late 17th century from 1683 to about 1699. And the Great Turkish War is probably the last great hurrah of the Ottoman Empire. If you know about the Ottoman Empire, it was a state that started to weaken in the 17th and 18th centuries. It comes later, the so-called sick man of Europe. You know about that. And was really considered Leopold's greatest military success. He formed an alliance with a bunch of other states, such as Russia, Poland, Holy Roman Empire, what became known as the Holy League. And the Holy League was an alliance of Christian states that wanted to push the Turks out of Europe because they were, Muslim. And so he formed this alliance against them. And eventually what happened was the Turks responded by invading Austria in 1683. They actually laid siege to Vienna. It was later called sometimes the Second Siege of Vienna, I think is what some people call it, or Siege of Vienna. And I think without help from some of the states like Poland and Russia, Vienna may have been taken by the Turks. And there was a famous Polish king you may have heard of named Jan Sobieski, sometimes called Jan III or John III Sobieski. He rallied forces with a huge cavalry, one of the largest cavalries ever, I think, amassed in history, something like 18,000 men on horseback. They crushed the Turkish forces and forced them to retreat from Vienna. So, yeah, the Turks would end up losing that war because of that holy league they founded. And over time, what happened was Leopold's forces would eventually take over all of Hungary. They controlled Transylvania. They even seized control of what is called Slovenia, which is kind of close to Italy, kind of like to the northeast of Italy, I think, or east of Italy is where it's at. Took over that too, as well. And all this was ceded to him through the Treaty of Karlowitz, which ended the Great Turkish War in 1699. So the Turks never really had much control of Central Europe after that. And over time, they start losing control of Eastern Europe as well. So their empire really starts going down after that. Leopold was also involved in forming this alliance in the 1680s that was called the League of Augsburg, which was like a German alliance throughout Germany. It was formed mostly to oppose Louis XIV when he invaded Germany in 1688. Sparking a big war in Europe called the 9 Years' War, which would drag on for almost a decade. So a lot of states joined it. Like I think even England and a bunch of other countries joined it against Louis XIV. And they also had the War of the Spanish Succession too, 1701, 1713, when he also fought Louis XIV. And that particular conflict was caused by the fact that the king of Spain, Charles II, ran out of heirs, and so he gave the throne to Louis XIV's grandson, Philip of Anjou, who became Philip V. This angered the Habsburgs in Germany, so they tried to get it back. And I think if you know about it, he tried to put his one of his sons on the throne. Leopold did, which was Charles, later Charles VI, but he failed. So France and Spain end up being Bourbon. If you know that. After that Spanish Succession War would end. Also, another thing about Leopold Leopold's the one that started this new palace in Vienna, Austria, which became like the capital of the Habsburg Empire, which is called usually Schloss Schönbrunn is what they usually call it, which is just means chateau or palace. But people call it Schönbrunn Palace today, of course. It became the central court and palace of the Habsburgs that they're, of course, well known for today, which I've got a lot of pictures of right here. Here it is right there, Schönbrunn Palace. It's like the summer palace of the Habsburgs. And the name Schönbrunn is a nickname which came from the fact that there was some kind of spring or well that was nearby, which Schönbrunn means beautiful spring or beautiful well. And this was a palace that was built over many years by many different like monarchs of the emperors of the Austrians, and I think he started on Leopold, and then I think Empress Maria Theresa did some work on it, and then I think up to like I want to say Emperor Franz Joseph I, a lot of work has been done to kind of remodel it the way it looks like today. It did not start out as a huge palace like you're looking at. I think in the 1540s, some of the earlier emperors built there originally. There was a mansion I know there called Katterberg originally. And then over time, by the 1600s, they began to expand on it. And it does have a lot of rooms, and I believe the amount of rooms in it is about, how many is it? It's like over 1,400 rooms. 1,441 rooms are in the palace today. I think you can only view about 40, 50 rooms today overall. It was a Baroque style palace, by the way, which is I think is often called Rococo, which is like a type of Italian style. And a lot of the interior of Schönbrunn was designed or redesigned by Empress Maria Theresa, of course, who was one of their great rulers who reigned in the mid 18th century, which we'll probably be talking about her later. And so yeah, Schönbrunn was kind of like this showy palace that was kind of a copy, of like Versailles that we had mentioned before about that. And a lot of, here's more on the information on it right here, but it's, called Rococo is usually what they called it. 1690s, they started really on the main thing right there you're looking at right there. But those two right there, those two heads of state, Maria Theresa and Franz Joseph, did probably most of the work on it, of what it looks like today overall. It is famous for a lot of musicians showing up there, to give performances, like Mozart especially, and Johann Strauss, I think, were well known for like, especially Mozart. Mozart did a lot of some of his great masterpieces, like the one about Figaro, I know was one when he did, I know as well. Napoleon supposedly lived there for a while after he defeated the Austrians in the Napoleonic Wars, which is true about that as well. And I think the guy that lived there the longest, Franz Joseph I, who was one of the last major rulers of the Habsburgs, who reigned up to like World War I, lived there his whole entire life for like 86 years, which is true about that. They do have, of course, Emperor Charles VI. You have, of course, which he, of course, would come to power right after Leopold would die. Although he had a brother that reigned briefly, of course, for about, I think, just a few years after his father died. And I think he reigned for, he probably reigned like 6 years, I think, and died real young. You can see there Joseph I. And one thing about Charles VI, he's known for issuing this so-called pragmatic sanction you may have heard about, because he was the last direct male descendant of the Habsburg. In fact, the Habsburg line really ends with him. I guess you could say he and his daughter, I guess, which he had two daughters. He didn't have any sons. He had Maria Theresa, the one they're talking about, of course, in the video, and then Maria Anna also as well. And what happened was, under like German law, like Salic law, they call it sometimes, only like the males can inherit basically titles and land. And so what he did to kind of get around that, he issued this kind of edict. It was called the Pragmatic Sanction in 1713. And what it did was it allowed a female, like one of his daughters, to inherit like the titles and the land. Basically. And so Empress Maria Theresa, as you know, which we'll be talking about later, I probably won't get to her today. She'll come in, of course, and take over, the Habsburg Empire and reign until about 1780. She's considered one of the most famous female rulers in history. She's up there with, Catherine the Great, Elizabeth I, you may have also heard about as well, who reigns around the same time and all that. And she'll control all the Habsburg dominions. Later, she'll be empress, Holy Roman Empress as well, but that's through marriage that she'll, of course, obtain that as well. So I'm going to get more into that. I'll get more into that, of course, later next week. I get more into talking about the Age of Absolutism, because I'm going to finish up the Habsburgs on probably on Tuesday next week, and then I'll get into talking about Prussia, like the Kingdom of Prussia, especially Frederick the Great. Be probably the most famous one we'll talk about. So yeah, hopefully that answered the question about what you were talking about, Kiera. Yeah, we're talking about Empress Maria Theresa, which I'll get to more next time. I think I've got a little short video clip I'll show on her too, about her early life next week. So before I go, reminder, don't forget, you still got those two quizzes. Of course, you've got Age of Discovery quiz. That's due, I think it's due tomorrow. Again, I'm going to give you extended time on it to get it done till tomorrow night, midnight. And then don't forget the video quiz on Hernan Cortez. Of course, I posted that the other day. Go to quizzes and get that done as well. And if you have any comments, questions, of course, about this lecture, let me know. Of course, Kiera had a question earlier. Of course, I hopefully answered for you. But if you got something else to answer, give me a question about something, just send it to me, via my YouTube channel, of course. And I hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. I guess y'all have plans and all that. So y'all take care, and I'll see you next Tuesday, of course, with another lecture on the Age of Absolutism. So have a good weekend, everybody. So take care.